if you find that you have that capability, but we have muted all the participants for the presentation just because we have a large group and it's a growing group as I'm even doing this introduction. So we are asking that everybody remain muted. And the third element is that we are going to have some time for questions around 4 o'clock. So feel free to jot down a few notes. If you want, you can try to capture things in the chat as well, but we encourage you to keep your questions until the end so that we can answer them all together. Also, of course, in this day and age, what is an event without some social media, right? So we encourage you to follow People for Community Recovery on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram as well. But particularly for this event, we're using the hashtags HBD, or Happy Birthday Hazel, Lift Up EJ, so Lift Up Environmental Justice, and then a longer hashtag, Environmental Justice for All. And this allows us to make sure that we capture your comments, your reactions, your thoughts, your birthday wishes, all across the internet. So if you use these, this will help us keep the conversation together, and hopefully we'll draw more people to the fantastic work that's being led by Cheryl and that's being led by Dr. Bullard as well. All right, we can go to the next one, Ethan. All right, so this next slide is just a little, a bit of an explanation for how to use Zoom if you're not familiar. We encourage you to tell us where you're calling in from, or you're zooming in from. On the bottom of your control panel in the window, there's an icon that looks like a chat bubble or a dialogue bubble. It says chat underneath. That is where you can introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining us from. We know we have plenty of people in Chicago, but we have people from coast to coast and possibly even across the world. So chime in. We want to know where you're calling in from. Also, again, we're asking that everybody remain muted. And if you do need to stop your video, we encourage you to do that. Those icons are in the bottom left part of your control panel, and that will just make sure that we are all together and keeping one another safe as well. If you have any trouble with your audio, we encourage you to dial in. So if you're mobile, you can tune in by phone, and this is the necessary information that you'll need to do that. All right, looks like we've got folks from all over. So I'm going to pass, oh, actually, before we get our program started, I do want to acknowledge a few folks that we have in the room. Of course, the entire staff over at PCR, People for Community Recovery. We have got Courtney Hansen, we have Ethan also on the line. We have a number of other board members, specifically Bernadette, I saw you, and Nikki Hoskins as well. And then we also truly appreciate Jordan Lewis joining from Congressman Rush's office to be a part of this presentation. And with that, I think I have covered all of our beginning tips and tricks, and we are really looking forward to this conversation with Cheryl Johnson and Dr. Robert Bullard. Nikki, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. It is not a coincidence that Black people are disproportionately affected by environmental pollutants. It is also not a coincidence that Black women and people of lower socioeconomic status are most affected. If you haven't witnessed this with your own eyes, then you've probably read the Toxic Waste and Race report from the United Church of Christ, which details how Black communities and women are disproportionately affected by environmental hazards. Indeed, this is not a coincidence. This data reflects a continuation of our national system of governance that values certain lives over others and that values profit over persons. We are here today because for decades, Black women have been fighting against this. They have been on the front lines fighting for justice and raising their voices to say that difference does not mean disposability. Beginning in the 1950s, when Dr. King was still just getting a college education, there was Ella Baker, Septima Clark, Fannie Lou Hamer. They were leading marches, educating their communities, teaching them how to read, since for decades, Black people weren't even allowed to read. They talked on the vote and started the different Democratic parties. These Black women of the civil rights movement paved the way for women and children like Dolly Burwell and Almina Mays, who made national news when they used their bodies to block dump trucks filled with PCB-laced garbage from entering their community in Warren County, North Carolina in 1982. This was around the same time that Hazel Johnson began documenting environmentally related illnesses in Oakdale Gardens. Since moving to the gardens, her spouse became ill and her children struggled with what they later found was environmentally induced asthma. But Hazel Johnson understood what was happening immediately. In 1962, she had just migrated from Chicago, from an area that's called the Cancer Alley in New Orleans, Louisiana, where chemical plants were being placed in Black communities and were causing high rates of cancer. Refusing to let this systemic environmental injustice against Black communities persist, Hazel went door to door talking to families about health and environmental issues. During this process, she gathered her community, folks like Helen Bronow and her daughter Ophelia Bronow, among others. They joined Hazel Johnson to fight against what she insightfully termed environmental racism. So I'm saying all of this to show how the environmental justice movement and the movement for our civil rights have historically been led by Black women. These Black women, who don't always receive the level of importance that their male peers garner, refuse to leave a damaged earth for the future generations. So today, we honor Hazel Johnson's legacy, as well as the people of all genders and races who fought alongside her. We are honoring her today with a conversation between environmental activist Cheryl Johnson and Professor Robert Bullard. By way of introduction, Cheryl Johnson serves as People for Community Recovery's Executive Director. She is the daughter of the late Hazel Johnson, who founded PCR and is known as the mother of the environmental justice movement. Cheryl learned the fundamentals of community organizing from her mother and carries on the work of PCR's mission to enhance the quality of life of residents living in communities affected by pollution. A lifelong resident of Oakdale Gardens, Cheryl has played an integral role in the success of PCR's programs and administration since 1987. Under Cheryl's leadership, PCR has stopped discriminatory recruiting practices from the Ford Motor Company on the far South Side. They prevented hundreds of units in Oakdale Gardens from being torn down and displacing residents. They've pressured the CHA to create a redevelopment plan that included community input. They've secured safe environmental cleanups on the South Side and stopped another landfill from being placed in their community. Cheryl's deep community connection and long-term vision for a thriving far South Side and commitment to carrying out her mother's legacy fuels her work. We also have Dr. Robert Bullard. He is often described as the father of environmental justice. He is the former dean of the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs at Texas Southern University. Professor Bullard currently is Distinguished Professor of Urban Planning and Environmental Policy. Prior to coming to TSU, he was founding director of the Environmental Justice Resource Center at Clark Atlanta University. He received his PhD degree from Iowa State University. He is an award-winning author of 18 books that address sustainable development, environmental racism, urban land use, industrial facility sightings, community reinvestment, housing, transportation, climate justice, disasters, emergency response, and community resilience. He is co-founder of the HBCU Climate Change Consortium. Dr. Bullard is also a proud US Marine Corps veteran. It is with great honor that I welcome Cheryl Johnson and Dr. Robert Bullard.
Thank you, Nikki. That was very detailed. And I don't know how to even come back from the information that I think you just gave our conversation. Did she, Dr. Bullard?
Yeah, I think she did.
She did a good job. Yeah. But before we even get started, Doc, I always like to pay homage to people who was great leaders in this movement. Me and you have a relationship for over 30 some years, and remember Dana Alston, for those who have passed away, that many of you don't know, Damu, Pessy Oliver, right, from Texarkana, I mean, these are the women that and men that really inspire me. And just, I mean, just losing from WEAC, I'm bad with this, y'all, so
Cecil.
excuse me.
Cecil
When I'm
Portman
talking
Mark.
about somebody, I tend to forget their name, so excuse Cecil, you know, and I had the opportunity to talk to him for about an hour and a half a week before he passed, you know, just getting that inspiration from people who has been doing this work for over 30 years. We got Dr. Beverly White, you know, I rely on her. I call her my sister because my mother's from New Orleans. And I used to try to understand why my mother was so stubborn this way. And Dr. Wright would tell me, because she's from New Orleans. That's how the New Orleans women are, you know. So it's a great honor to be in your company, Dr. Bullard. My mother loved you. You know that. She expressed it to you all the time because she never came back home without a story about you and how you take care of. So it's a high privilege today to even be here to have this conversation with you and many other of you who took out the time today to be here with us, right? So Dr. Bullard, take us back when the origin of environmental justice, you know, because one of the things, the beauty that I love before you get started, you guys, the beauty that I love about it brought everybody. I seen everybody. People. I live in public housing in Algier Garden, one of the segregated areas of the city of Chicago. I never really got to interact with any other race but my own until I became a grown woman. So to be able to go to a conference and be around people that I never had the time to get to know and love from all races, that's the beauty of environmental justice. So Doctor, so take us to that time when we was the origin of this and why it's so, and give us why it's so critical to even today as we speak.
Yes, well, thanks a lot, Cheryl. Yeah, I loved your mother, and she was my hero, and we worked together for, oh goodness, decades. When Hazel started PCR before it got incorporated, 1979, in the South Side, on the South Side in Outfield Garden, I was 3 years out of graduate school, finding myself in Houston, Texas, and in 1979, my wife came home, who's a lawyer, who came home one day and said, "Bob, I've just sued the state of Texas, and this company is trying to put this landfill in the middle of this Black middle-class suburban neighborhood." So I was doing housing discrimination and residential segregation and racism redlining. Environment was not my forte. I was a demographer, but I dealt with housing. So I was accidentally pushed into this by a woman and by my wife. So 1979 in Chicago, discovering racism as it relates to environment and who gets the worst of the worst. And in Houston, the same phenomena. We're talking however many miles apart, Midwest versus Southwest, but the issues are the same. And so when you look at, this is before the National Environmental Justice Movement was born in Warren County, North Carolina in 1982. So we're talking 1979, basically 4 years before there was a national movement. So it meant individuals doing this work were sort of isolated. They were doing it almost as if you're alone, you're by yourself, and this is the only place this is going on. It was not until we started to connect the dots that Warren County and Reverend Benjamin Chavis and the Congressional Black Caucus and that big protest in Warren County that people went to jail, young people, old people. This is 1982. There was no movement before people started to collectively organize, mobilize, and understand it's not just on the South Side of Chicago, but it's also in the fourth largest city in the country, Houston, Texas, a city that has the largest Black community in the South. 500,000 people, but they were black people, but they were invisible. I wrote a book called Invisible Houston. That's not a plug, but it is. So the idea was after people discovered that African Americans, low income and no income, high income or low income. The case that I dealt with in Houston of this company wanted to put this landfill in this black middle class suburban neighborhood. Did you hear what I said? 95% of the people own their home. So it was not this, it wasn't about poverty. These are middle class black folks in the suburbs, but what was the leveler was racism. And so starting to organize, mobilize, and understand how this happens, Toxic Race and Race, 1987, the beginning of a movement. 1990, the University of Michigan Conference on Race and the Incidence of Environmental Hazards. Dumping in Dixie book came out. This is when I met Hazel. We were in Washington, D.C., coming to the Washington, D.C. to deal with the EPA. Hazel and I were on a National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, a NEJAC committee by EPA on the Clinton Gore transition team. And that's when the executive order was signed in 94. So it started to get traction. But before that, people didn't believe even the data. They didn't believe that black people are being dumped on or being poisoned or somehow or even cared about the environment. That was this myth that black people don't care about the environment, that we're not environmentalists just because we're not members of environmental organizations. So those are the roots of the movement. And we started to get more involvement of people, of grassroots mobilization, and people rising up and saying, no, my community is not going to be a dumping ground. And I got lots of stories with Hazel, and I'll share them later. But the idea is that when you look at the vast majority, 75% of the grassroots environmental justice organizations of color are led by women, family, home, community, and tough women, take no prisoner, Marine Corps type, just when they latch on, they don't let go. That's Hazel. That's Hazel.
So, doing all this, what are some of give us a few examples with some of the most positive changes that you have seen during this period of time? And even when it comes to some of the challenges, that we may be facing today as a result of this work. And even, I noticed I'm compounding this question, the intersectionality of things that affect us every day in our life, that how do we get the people to understand that it's all connected? And those are some of the precursors of why our community get dumped on or not. So I know that's a loaded question, but
yeah,
it's floating there, Doc. You got me floating.
As a matter of fact, I wrote a book on all of that.
Mm-hmm.
No, things have changed a lot. In 1979, when Hazel was in Chicago, in 82 with PCR, organizing, mobilizing, 1982 was a year that most Americans didn't believe there was a relationship between the environment and race and class, and that even in 1989, when I was trying to get a publisher to publish a book that I had expanded the Houston study to look at the Southern United States, Dixie, I got nasty letters back from publishers saying the environment is neutral. Everybody is treated the same. And then how can you talk about environmental justice? There's no such thing. You can't use environment and justice in the same frame. It has taken decades, and there's still denial, even right now as I speak, that environmental racism is not real, that somehow we make this up. But again, there are more people, there have been more research, documentation, there are more organizations, there are more colleges and universities teaching this stuff, whether in the law school, School of Public Health. There are more community-based organizations now receiving funds still inadequate to do this work, and they're doing great work. They're making change. So even though the issues have bubbled up from the grassroots, they have reached the White House. As a matter of fact, 1994, Clinton signed the executive order on environmental justice, and Hazel and I, we were standing there in the Oval Office, witnessing the signing. We've made progress, but there's so much work to do. The connection between where you live and your health. Zip code is still the most potent predictor of health and well-being. You tell me your zip code and I can tell you how healthy you are. Zip codes that are even adjacent to each other can have, depending on what kinds of amenities are there, or what kinds of locally unwanted land uses, dumps, poison, etc., you can have a disparity of 15 to 20 years in terms of life expectancy. The idea that there are outcomes, negative outcomes by discrimination in housing, in redlining, in placing facilities in the quote the path of least resistance, or not providing adequate services, healthcare services, transportation services, parks and green space, grocery stores. I mean, this is not rocket science, but it is science. It's called political science. Who gets what, when, where, and why. And what we've tried to do over the last 4 decades is to put it in simple terms, that every community has a right to equal protection of our environmental, housing, transportation, energy, health, civil rights, human rights laws and regulations, and that no community should have the wrong complexion for protection. I wrote a book in 2012 called The Wrong Complexion for Protection. You understand that this is about movements, and now we have millennials and younger who outnumber my generation, baby boomers. They outnumber us, and they are coming into their own in terms of being unafraid, unapologetic about fighting for racial justice. Cuts across racial, environmental justice, climate justice is about economic justice, is about energy justice, all of that. So when you said the intersectionality, it connects. And what we've been able to do is to work with our community partners and academic institutions, with our voluntary organizations and our faith-based institutions, to really force the issue from the small communities all the way up right now to the White House. And environmental justice leaders have been pushing the administration, this incoming administration, before they were elected, to really focus on these issues that communities see as priorities, not lip service, but real policies, programmatic areas, and resources. You know, all of that was on the ballot in November, and I think we won. So now we have to make sure that like the mailman, deliver. We got to deliver.
It'd be correct to say, you know, and back in 1979, that was only 10 years after the erection of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, to be frank. And in 1979, US EPA didn't have no mandate to work with communities, only academic institutions, and to regulate industry. It wasn't until the signing of the Executive Order 12898 that allowed US EPA to work with community and give us the same resources that they was given to academic institutions. But all along, in between that time, academic and community came together and came up with 17 different types of principles that we presented to EPA and to the White House, and we're living that today. So we have progress, and I look at, and just the other day, I was just looking to say, wow, you know, how many years did it take us to get to civil rights, to get to that passion and to the voting right? It's almost like they're almost an equal amount. Why do it take so many decades for something to come to fruition, as my mother used to say? But it's because of the hard work that we do as individuals in this country. that make these policy come to fruition. It's not, I do understand the government just ain't going to do it for the better good of the people. We are the better good of the people that got to make them do the better good of the people. So when you talk about environmental justice issues about fossil fuels and polluter, it's really bigger than that, right? So how is the environmental justice movement connected to the various movements, Dr. Bullard?
Let me just digress a bit. When you were talking about the EPA was started in 1970 by Republican President Richard Nixon, right. And PCR started this work in 79. I started my work in Houston in 79. That's only if you talk about the first Earth Day was 1970, and the next Earth Day that was coming up was 1980. The first Earth Day did not include justice. It did not include a whole lot of people of color. Did not include a whole lot of issues that dealt with racial inequality and economic inequality. And so that Earth Day, that environmental movement has had to grapple with its own systemic racism and white privilege. When my wife filed her case in 1979, Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management Corporation, in 1979, and when I did the study that showed that 5 out of 5 of the city-owned landfills were in Black neighborhoods, 6 out of 8 of the city-owned incinerators in Houston were in Black neighborhoods, and 3 out of 4 of the privately owned landfills were in predominantly Black neighborhoods. 82% of all the garbage dumped in Houston from the 1920s up to 1978 it was dumped in Black neighborhoods. When I took that data, this is a federal lawsuit. When I took that data to some of the white enviros and asked them, can you help us with this lawsuit, fighting this landfill? I got back. Isn't that where the landfill is supposed to be? Oh, when I took this same data to the national, the oldest civil rights organization, I'm not going to call any names, but you know the initials, we got back. We don't work on environment. We work on housing discrimination, discrimination in voting, education, employment, et cetera. It has taken almost 2 decades for the environmental groups, the green groups, and I'll call it NAACP to come around to see that poisoning Black people and people of color is a civil rights issue. Now there's beginning to have that merger. We still need more working together and collaboration, and so we just can't leave it to the government to push this agenda. Environmental justice did not originate from the EPA. We had to force the government to do what it's supposed to do, is equal protection for all. We still have to force the government to protect all communities. Even though you have one set of laws, they are applied differentially depending on where you live, how much money you have, and the color of your skin. That is a reality that we have to try to dismantle and make it justice for all. It's a fight. And again, this is not a sprint. It's a race. It's like a marathon relay. We know there's no such thing. But what you have to do is you have to run that 26.2 miles, and that Hazel has run, and then pass the baton to the next generation, like Cheryl, that she did, to run that next 26.2. We have to have each generation to keep that struggle going, keep that fight going, because if you let up, you'll get like in the church, they say backsliders. And now we've had a lot of backsliding in the last 4 years that have dismantled, disrupted, weakened. And now we have to roll those regulations back and strengthen them and don't let up. That's the charge and the challenge that's out there for environmental justice, economic justice, racial justice, criminal justice, food justice. Yes, in America, there are individuals that don't have enough money for food in this very wealthy country. So food justice, for parks justice, green space. We know that green space creates livability, calms children down. You've got a park to play in, whatever. It's one movement. I tell people I've written 18 books that cover a whole lot of area, but it's just one book. But don't tell anybody. It deals with a whole lot of issues that connect. That's what we have to do, and be good communicators, and then follow through with action. Follow through with action.
So is it fair to say, can we get where we need to go through the green capitalism? Or do we need to think a bigger change?
I think we need to think a bigger change. The system that we have in America currently is capitalism, and tweaking capitalism and using our laws on the books and using an equity lens and a justice lens and apply that across the board, whether it's dealing with access to healthcare, and access to education, employment, et cetera, and not just rely on market forces. Who's got the money to afford college, then you can go to college. I mean, that has held back this country in terms of the power of our intellect. And so it means that to democratize opportunity and give people the chance and the opportunity to access those kinds of things that we're talking about, and move into this green economy. Well, we can't leave behind folks in communities that are stuck with coal power plants, that are stuck with dirty diesel buses, when everybody else is getting clean fuel, zero emitting, or whatever. We have to fight for justice, even when we talk about moving to a more resilient, healthy society, and we talk about climate. We can't have this climate gentrification that's somehow pushing us off the high ground because it's too valuable for us, and then we get pushed down into the lowlands, and we still getting flooded while everybody's saying, "Oh, we have walkable communities, we have green communities, we have more sustainable communities." We have to make sure that there is a equity and justice lens in terms of our policies, our planning, and how resources get allocated. That's what I see right now, not pie in the sky, but right now. We have to fight for that right now.
Oh wow! So that even goes to the point that it's just so important today for our younger generation to be able to have this type of information or training, because just like you said, that we missed a whole lot of opportunity through the opportunity to learn how to work in our community. My best defense when we was organizing in our community, but particularly around lead-based paint, when Clarice took the risk from US EPA,
Clarice,
and we was the
Gaylord,
first.
right. Yes, sir.
We was the first grassroots community-based organization in the country to do lead abatement training in the community, to take a technical training. And she's the only one that really took that risk, because because of the perception and the implicit bias that people have about people living in public housing. I'm still fighting that right now today. Now, a lot of people ask me, why do I live here? I say, because this is where I was raised. If you want to talk about sustainability, I'm your poster child for that, because guess what? March 18 of this year, I've been living in this community 59 years, and I never lived anywhere else. So I'm not trying to prove a point, but this is my home. And I want to be able to be engaged in the decision-making processes in my community and not continue to be polluted on the south side of Chicago. And this is where the education is missing. How do we even though we understand that the intersectionality of different issues impact our community to be polluted or not, right? Yeah. But how do we convey this information to make the average person in our community get engaged or be part of this conversation? Because one thing that I have learned from watching the past administration under Trump, he got people to talk about politics that never talked about politics before. And that was real effective. Anytime somebody come up to me and said, "Sure, I never voted in my life and I'm 62 years old, I'm going to vote." Yeah. That was powerful to me. Yeah. So how can that be translated into this movement? Because you cannot do this movement without the intersectionality of everything that impact our Black and poor, brown, not just poor communities, but particularly our Black and brown communities. How do we, I know you don't have the answer, but I just think this conversation needs to happen more. And it has been, for our organization being around for so long, and I know how people had discriminated against our organization, but that my mother always told me, don't bother with that. do what your heart says what you're going to do.
Yeah.
Because this is what you are ordained. And that's what she said she was ordained to do. She didn't care about it because a lot of the name callers, I heard you just say about all the name calling people, the disbelief, and let's not talk about the political community when we was dealing with this back in the 80s and the 90s. Yeah. But if it wasn't for people like Dr. Bullard, Beverly Wright, and Tom Goldtooth, Pam Talley, Deion Ferris, she was just, she'll knock you, she'll hit a home run on you. You don't mess with Deion Ferris. You know, you got Leslie Fields, you got Monique Harding, you got all these powerful, you got Lula Odom that is on here somewhere. I can't see her now. Lula Odom, if it wasn't for these people just fighting to educate us and prepare us for what the future is going to look like. And how hopeful are you with the current administration now?
Well, let me ask
environmental justice, not climate justice. I want to hear about environmental justice. They always talk about climate justice.
Yeah, let me ask the first part, then I get to the second part. I'm very hopeful, and there are some solutions, positive solutions. Dr. Beverly Wright and I, we organized the HBCU Climate Change Consortium, the HBCU Equity Consortium. We reactivated, relaunched the National Black Environmental Justice Network. We are building intergenerational working together. Our HBCU community-based organization consortium we're training young people to work on these issues and go out and do this work. In some cases, volunteer. In other cases, get the training to do the jobs that pay. And the fact that this administration has a mandate in terms of folks went out to vote, turnout in record numbers, and Black folks resurrected Biden's campaign in South Carolina and pushed them toward the nomination. And Black folks disproportionately voting in large numbers in Georgia, and those 2 Senate seats even out the Senate. It makes a difference. And so now it's about accountability. I've reviewed some of the environmental justice work, language, policies, programs, initiatives, and I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful, and I'm looking at it, and it has gone farther than any administration to date in pulling these pieces together and making the right appointments and taking environmental justice. Not just pushing it in EPA, but pushing across various agencies, whether it's transportation or energy or Homeland Security or Department of Justice, Interior, except Health and Human Services. And particularly with this COVID and looking at the environmental impacts, pollution on COVID, the disproportionate impact of infection and hospitalization and deaths of COVID among Black people in those communities that are disproportionately impacted by pollution. We have to attack this like it's a war, because it has been a war on our communities. And we have to hold this administration accountable. We have to have some metrics, some measures to say, this is what we want in the first 100 days. This is what we're demanding. We want to see things move forward. We don't want to see our stuff get pushed to the back of the line. Push it up. Those are the kinds of things now, I think, because of our movement is much stronger today than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. EJ folks can make demands, and those demands can be met in terms of some appointments and in terms of some of the policies that are getting pushed in. And EJ leaders and organizations are not, they are unapologetic. We are unapologetic about using our strength and our power in numbers to make change. Now, that's what I see happening right now.
Okay. But you know, when you start thinking about all this, what kind of advice that you would give the younger generation that want to get engaged with the EJ movement?
Well, this is what I give them. advice. Every social movement that has been successful in this country, in the United States of America, has had a strong youth, student, young people driven component that pushes the envelope further than more traditional mature leaders and mature organizations. This is true what's happening right now, whether it's Black Lives Matter or organizations fighting for racial justice and fighting for environmental justice and all the other justice issues that are coming, health justice that are coming together, and looking at young people saying, okay, you can make a difference. Young people went out and voted in record numbers, and seeing the outcome of those votes in those elections making a difference. And so I think it's about, as I said, young people right now, millennials and younger outnumber baby boomers. So you have the numbers. And so when you come into your own with numbers and you have that majority and you are organized, you can make a difference in terms of pushing the agenda, the progressive agenda, further than my generation, who may see it as a threat. And they are wedge issues that keep us from dealing with real issues, whether it's marijuana or same-sex marriage or abortion or whatever. Younger generations don't see those issues as a wedge issue to a greater extent than my generation. So I have hope in this young generation, and there's a lot of good work going on by youth-led organizations and youth leaders that are pushing for this justice. They were out this summer. You know, that awakening was this summer in terms of racial justice. These were young people, for the most part, out there pushing, that were fearless. That's like my generation in the 60s. We were fearless. We were not afraid of going to jail. I mean, we're not afraid of the threats that were lodged against us. So this generation has to continue to be a generation for change, to be change agents. That's important.
Great. That's great conversation. I guess we can really open it up because you did it for me. You energized my young self, even though I call myself a senior citizen when I can use it at my advantage. Yeah. All right, Kyra, I want to turn it back to you.
Sure, I need to go and plug. I'm on my laptop because my big computer is messing up, and I forgot to plug it in. I need to go and get the plug.
Okay, we'll give you a minute. So we could just open up the floor, Kyra.
Yeah.
Have a discussion till you come back.
Sure.
Anybody want to make any? I guess I can recognize some people who's on here. And some of the people I don't want to miss anybody. You got Donnell Wilkins from Detroit. She's outstanding. Been part of this movement for over 30-some years, you know. And I see a lot of the support of PCR. I see my board member. I see Rico. I see Scott, who just put in the comment that we've been doing this for a long time, educating young people to inspire them to go be the best they can be. And if you have an interest in the environmental justice movement, you know, that's where I would try to convince them to see, because if you're going to be any kind of scientist, engineer, focus on what's surrounding your community, because that's your teacher, that's your education. So if we wanted to share any comments that was in the chat room, we
Sure.
open to that.
Yeah, I'll remind everyone that we are inviting your questions or comments even in the chat. Again, the bottom toolbar on the Zoom window, right in the middle, there's this icon that looks like a dialogue box or like a little bubble. Click that, and then another box should pop up. That's where you can ask your questions for Cheryl or Dr. Bullard, and we're going to do our best to get through as many of those as we can. So feel free to use the chat box for that. And then, of course, we encourage you to follow PCR online on Facebook at PCR_Chicago, I believe, and definitely also on Twitter, and to stay connected. But we're using these hashtags: environmental justice for all, HBD Hazel. Again, we are honoring the life, legacy, and birthday of Hazel Johnson, and also the hashtag Lift Up EJ, because we know that this conversation needs the eyes, needs the energy as well. So use the chat, follow us on social media, use these hashtags so we can be sure to keep the conversation together and going. All right, I'm seeing some things come in too, Courtney.
Great. Okay, so we have some comments and some questions. We have one from Jim that's for Dr. Bullard, so maybe we can wait till he's back. But the question
Oh, he's
is,
back.
oh,
He's
okay,
back.
wonderful. What's the status of the EPA's Superfund program? It says, I can remember hearing a lot about notorious sites where I grew up in Massachusetts. Is it active and vigilant today, the EPA Superfund program?
The Superfund program is still in existence, but I think there has to be in the transition from one administration to the next, there has to be really some systematic examination of where it stands. And I think the question is the extent to which that program again becomes a very aggressive programs in going after the kinds of environmental contamination and health risks associated with these particular sites. I've seen a number of studies showing that. Study came out, a couple of weeks ago. They're showing that a large share of Superfund sites are located near public housing, low-income housing. Now that study came out, but it should be no surprise. And there's another study came out saying that there's 60% of Superfund sites are at risk from climate change in terms of sea level rise. Well, if you look at where many of the Superfund sites are located, like here in Houston after Harvey, that were drowned, they're located, disproportionately located in environmental justice communities. So, and so the program needs to, they need to accelerate the kinds of work that's needed, because again, we're talking hazardous waste sites and contamination, which are disproportionately located in low income and people of color communities. And so it becomes a EJ issue. And so we need to make sure that it becomes active again under this new administration.
Thank you so much. We have a few more questions coming in. Another one is about Superfund, so I'm going to go to that and then we'll do the stack in order. So,
hey, Dr. Bullard, I would like, while she's looking for it, Dr. Bullard, I would like to, at one point under the Clinton administration, they was doing the reauthorization of the Superfund Act, right? And then what mobility did it have under the Obama administration, or did it have any, to your knowledge?
Well, I'm not familiar with any studies or whatever, so I don't want to speak to that because I have no data.
Okay.
But I do know that there are still many problems associated with these sites, and in terms of getting them cleaned up, it's still problematic. There are, like here in Houston, for example, there are two waste sites, cancer clusters in Houston's 5th Ward, a predominantly Black ward in Houston, that is showing a cancer cluster. And this is stuff that was dumped years ago in old creosote, and it's these companies are still in business, and so there are issues that need to be addressed in terms of the cleanup and monitoring, et cetera. So I do think that whether it's on the Superfund or whether it's voluntary cleanup or whatever, we need to get back to this whole idea of making sure that communities, in communities where there are a number of hazardous waste sites that pose great risk, we need to do everything that we can to clean them up. And where there are brownfield sites or sites that may be contaminated or may not be contaminated, that may be reusable after cleanup, we need to make sure that those sites, once they get cleaned up, if they're in our communities, that cleanup does not trigger gentrification or that the residents themselves don't somehow get displaced, particularly as these close-in neighborhoods get discovered, it gets cleaned up, and that's what's happening in a number of places where the sites get cleaned up, and then infrastructure is placed in those areas, and then the residents that have lived in those neighborhoods for many years, it becomes too valuable for them, and so they get displaced and get pushed somewhere else. That's what we have to guard against in terms of the issues of environmental contamination, cleanup, affordable housing issues, as well as the issues around livability. These are all issues. These are all environmental justice issues. Environmental justice is not just about pollution. It's also about amenities, about things that most middle class communities take for granted: grocery stores, parks, green space, access to good transportation, etc. That's what we fight for. Also, that's environmental justice. Also.
Yeah, but I want to ask in the ranking criteria too with the Superfund is that Chicago has always been ineligible for to be placed on the national priority list because we doesn't meet the one of the criteria, like our source of drinking water have to be impacted, and since we are on a system that made us ineligible. So we was trying to hopefully when I remember back there was conversation about the reauthorization of the Superfund, that they should incorporate air quality issue, air emissions and stuff of an area. And if they do that, if we add that criteria to the selection process, that would help Chicago, particularly in our area, to be cleaned up with Superfund funding, because we have air quality issues in this area, but air quality issue is not one of the criteria to be selected to go on the national priority list for a Superfund site.
I think the new EPA administrator, Michael Regan, that's coming in, hopefully he'll get approved by the Senate. I think there are a number of areas that I think environmental justice communities can approach the new administration in terms of looking at, and in terms of whether it's air, water, waste, or other areas that may have been neglected, and in terms of how do we build environmental justice in rulemaking, environmental justice in terms of how the agency itself carries out its work. And so I think there will be opportunities to examine these kinds of rulemakings and permitting, and also in terms of having a good person that's nominated for President's Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ, and Brenda Mallory, to look at coming up with some real good guidances on environmental justice and some of the issues that cut across the different media, air, water, and soil, and other kinds of things that can really provide some type of guidance for some of the states. And because we know we got 50 states, and all 50 are not created equal, and some are some are better than others, and I won't give any names, but I live in a state called denial. It's called Texas.
All right, Courtney, we got any more questions in the chat room? Anyone?
Yeah, we've got quite a few questions, so
Okay.
I'm going to go in order here. And this may be a little related to what you were just addressing, Dr. Bullard, but Brianna Parker asked, how can we ensure the benefits of future legislation, like, for example, the Green New Deal, come to our communities?
Well, I think the idea of having new legislation and the Green New Deal is a concept. It's been floated about. There are a number of legislations bills that are out there, Environmental Justice Act. There are bills dealing with energy bills. There are other bills that are dealing with issues around how do we putting the different pieces together in terms of infrastructure, et cetera. All those bills deal with issues around environmental justice, transportation, infrastructure, climate, all those things. We have to make sure that as these bills go forward and the legislation, as the legislation rolls out, we have to make sure that that environmental justice and that equity lens is applied, so that we're not just thinking everything is in this one bill that's going to solve everything. If we talk about like looking at issues around food security, USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture. Yes, there's a whole lot of environmental justice in U.S. Department U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA. So when you talk about the issues around SNAP and children and that kind of stuff, we have to say that no child should go hungry in this country, and that in terms of school lunch programs and those are environmental justice issues, and so having legislation is one, but also having these executive orders that President Biden, that's a nice ring to it, President Biden is signing, they also have environmental justice in them, and that cuts across the equity, using that equity lens. It's very important that the voices of those frontline communities get written into the framing of legislation, but also in the framing of policies and other kinds of mandates that's driven through the executive actions that the president is signing. And again, I think the communities that are out there can keep the administration honest and keep it on its toes by making sure that people are staying informed and engaged. And so it's a two-way kind of thing. Once you elect people, you don't just say, well, you're on your own. No, there has to be continuous communication back and forth. And we have to have our organizations like PCR resourced so that they can have that participation, that engagement, that working together. And what I think is that, before this pandemic, most of the transition teams being a member meant that you had, if you were selected to be a member of the transition team, meant that you had to fly to Washington and spend your own dime to put yourself up in a hotel and buy an airplane ticket. So that kind of responsibility was not, being a member of a transition team was not equally distributed. It only meant that organizations that had discretionary money and individuals to do that. But what COVID did, it kind of like leveled the playing field, in that this administration, Biden-Harris transition team, I would say has been more, COVID has made it more democratic and more participatory because of people are not flying to Washington and setting themselves up in a hotel, and now it's mostly done through Zoom, and it's mostly done through people, organizations interacting with individuals who are either on the transition team or our organization members may be part of the transition team. So it has made for much more with authentic participation and authentic communications back and forth. And so you don't need to have a budget to participate. Now, it's good to have a budget to work on your priorities, but in terms of participating, it's more virtual kind of a thing.
Thank you, Dr. Bullard. I just want to remind folks that this event goes until 4:30, but I know we have some people that need to drop off. So because of that, we just wanted to mention that as we're talking about federal legislation and the new administration, we just want to let folks know that we're really excited to announce that Congressman Bobby Rush's office is going, or Congressman Rush will be introducing 3 new bills next month in honor of Black History Month. All 3 will honor Hazel Johnson. One will give her the Congressional Medal of Honor. One will put her on a postage stamp, and one would name April as Hazel M. Johnson Environmental Justice Month. So these are obviously wonderful awards to honor Hazel's legacy, but also just a way to lift up environmental justice and the EJ movement and the wonderful work that's continuing to happen. So stay tuned. We will be sending out more information about those bills as they get introduced, as well as ways you can take action to support them. So now that I've put that plug in, we can get back to the Q&A. Again, want to thank Congressman Rush's office for joining us, his staff, Jordan Lewis. We're really excited to be working with them on this, and we will give you all more information soon. So back to the Q&A. Thank you, Brianna, for your question. Melissa Gavin from Reamp had a great question, sort of related to what you've been saying. What are some of the things you'd like the current administration to prioritize in the first 100 days?
Oh, was that a question for me?
It was, yeah, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go right, take it away, Dr. Bullard.
Okay, I think it's important that the administration, and it's begun to do that, even though it's only been just a few days, has begun to roll back many of the environmental regulations that were weakened or somehow streamlined or pushed in a fast track mode, which many of them have had tremendous negative impact on environmental justice communities. To prioritize getting the kinds of individuals in those top level positions that understand the connection between all of these different issues that we're talking about when it comes to environmental justice, economic justice, and climate justice, and racial justice, and health equity, and health justice. And when we talk about getting the administration in tune to what's happening on the ground, and getting those kinds of first 10 days, first 100 days, etc. There are a number of initiatives that have been placed in terms of getting top level appointments on environmental justice in the different offices, and reporting directly to the White House, elevating environmental justice to the level that it's deemed, and not being confused, not getting somehow thinking that climate change and climate justice can somehow exclude environmental justice and racial justice. The pieces have been put back together that at one point was disaggregated, was broken apart. It's back together. Environmental justice is economic justice. And when we talk about economic justice, we're talking about the jobs, we're talking about access to capital, we're talking about small businesses, looking at COVID. Environmental justice is also about health justice. It's about workers. Economic justice is about making sure that our workers, these essential workers that are disproportionately made up of Black and other people of color, have to have the right kinds of protection. And we talk about raising the minimum wage to federal workers to $15 an hour. We're talking about economic justice and trying to make sure that our workers have a livable wage, and making sure that our that in terms of getting the legislative agenda in line with the policy agenda of the administration, bringing back in the U.S. Justice Department, bringing back the Civil Rights Division. We're talking civil rights enforcement. If you don't have civil rights enforcement, then you have all kinds of unmet kinds of needs for going after discrimination, all kinds of discrimination, including discrimination when it comes to enforcement of environmental laws. Bringing back the environment section in the Department of Justice to deal with environmental crimes. And there's a lot of things that are going on in our communities that's criminal. And we know it's criminal, and they need to be prosecuted when those things happen, as opposed to looking the other way and seeing it as a cost of doing business. Again, making sure that there's a harmonization of the executive orders that are being signed, as well as the policies that are being pushed out when it comes to legislation, and how we're going to make sure that that legislation can move forward. Getting the legislation, for example, looking at the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, for example. He said, what's that got to do with environmental justice? John Lewis and Al Gore put forth the first bill on environmental justice back in '91, somewhere like that. So having your voting rights somehow suppressed, and there's a lot of that, can impact who you can elect to fight for you in the halls of city halls and county commissions and state legislatures, and in terms of Congress. These are things that are priorities. And so our environmental justice movement, our environmental justice organizations are trying to tap into all of that in terms of the legislative kinds of priorities of this current administration, as well as these other executive actions.
Wonderful, thank you. We're going to try to get through as many questions as we can in the next 15 minutes. So if you asked a question, thank you. We'll do our best to get to it. Rory asks, can our speakers please share more about gentrification and other negative housing outcomes following environmental remediation? Is a community benefits agreement the best way to prevent gentrification / spiraling rent costs? Or do we need a variety of tactics to think about EJ in terms of housing and livable neighborhoods?
Let me just indicate that gentrification, displacement, the forces that drive that are economic and racial. Let me just put that on the table. And for example, natural and man-made disasters are generators and accelerators of gentrification. Money that flow down after disasters flow in a way that money follows money, money follows power, money follows whites. And as the money comes in, oftentimes the money will create a situation. I'm talking about federal funds that are supposed to be spent for communities that have been impacted to recover. But after major disasters, white communities end up about $126,000 better off than before the disaster. Black and communities of color end up about $29,000 worse off. And so you're creating this imbalance in neighborhoods that were once occupied by one racial ethnic group, become the upscaling of it, they get pushed out. We saw that in Hurricane Katrina in 2005, but a lot of communities have not had Katrina. That what they've had is basically a situation where communities, neighborhoods have been discovered, and the stigma of, quote, this Black neighborhood is taken off by instead of redlining, you have greenlining. Money flows in, the mortgages and other kinds of capital flow in, whereas before Black and brown residents could not get loans, regular loans, and they get these exorbitant loans with high interest rates, et cetera. And so how you combat that is we have to fight racial discrimination in the courts. We have to fight for fair housing. We have to fight for affordable housing. And when city dollars are being used, we have to make sure that our city government understands that there needs to be strings attached to that money, and not just quote let market forces drive it. If market forces will drive it, then you can predict when money competes against no money, you can predict who's going to win. And so you talk about the equitable development strategies, and you talk about the kinds of things that have been tried in communities. There is no cookie cutter solution to this, but there is one component that will underline successful programs and initiatives, and that's organize, mobilize, educate, persist, and make sure that you have and not afraid to use all of the tools in the toolkits, including litigation. And I think when we talk about this whole idea, every city in this country has a problem with housing affordability. Cities are now becoming very popular, and with that popularity and with that rediscovery, you get this idea that people want to live in the city. They want to move in the city, and you get this these economic pressures that overlay with the racial dynamics, and that's how you get this engine being pushed. Called gentrification. Gentrification is nothing more than old-fashioned push out. We had it in the 50s with urban renewal and community development, and now we have other kinds of gentrification. When you clean up neighborhoods, it becomes too clean and too valuable for the people that live there. That's what we have to guard against, and you try to build that into the process as the rules, as the hooks, that you can't go forward with this and create these anti-displacement mechanisms that trigger. No, we're not going to have this here, and have it written in writing and have it enforceable, and not just well, we're going to promise you this. Promises. No.
Wow, thank you. Let's try to do 1 to 2 more questions. We have so many good ones in the chat, and then we'll close out. So Jennifer asks, or says, this has been so inspiring. To either Dr. Bullard or Ms. Johnson, what are your thoughts about combating environmental racism on an international scale? For example, clean energy is so critical to combat climate change, but depends on critical minerals that are being mined in unprotected ways in indigenous impoverished communities. Do you know if folks are coordinating with advocates elsewhere? So either one of you, go right ahead.
Yeah, let me just tell a story that Hazel and I went all around the world in environmental justice at the 91 People of Color Summit. We developed those 17 principles. We took those principles to Rio de Janeiro. And by the time we got there a year later in 92, those principles have been translated into a dozen languages. So the idea of environmental justice the movement may have started in the US, but it is a global movement. Every UN summit, whether it's dealing with climate summit or the World Conference Against Racism that Hazel and I, we went to Durban, South Africa, or the World Summit, Rio Plus 20, that was in Johannesburg. These issues were resonated across the globe. So we're talking about G77 countries, developing countries that are dealing with extraction and the pollution that's left, and so the environmental justice issues resonate across the board. With COVID today, and with the development of the vaccine, that's a justice issue, that's a health issue, and that's an equity issue. So when we talk about these issues, we're not just limited to people of color and poor people in this country. The same thing is multiplied around the world. While we use our cell phones and while we do, we love them and whatever, There are communities that are suffering because of the mining of these what do you call them, these minerals that are precious minerals that are used in our cell phones and other kinds of technology. We have to what is other kinds of extraction that create problems in indigenous countries, in countries that have a large indigenous populations, where much of the extraction occurs. The same thing is reproduced here, but it's on a larger scale globally. We have to be concerned. We have to work with our global allies, and so environmental justice is a global movement. The quest for economic justice is a global movement, and climate justice is a global movement to combat the kinds of exploitation. There's a direct correlation between exploitation of land and exploitation of people, and we're talking human rights, and so we're talking about trying to dismantle the system of exploitation that creates wealth for a small while disadvantaging the many.
And I would just only add to that, whatever we do locally impact nationally and globally.
Yeah.
And it even, whatever happened globally affect us nationally and locally.
Yeah.
So it's all interrelated. And I'm not an expert on international stuff, but I know that around the country, everybody's fighting, around the world, everybody's fighting the same struggle for equality.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you,
Yes.
Cheryl, and thank you, Dr. Bullard. And thank you all for your wonderful questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but if you asked a question and we didn't get to it, we will try to follow up with you offline. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Nikki Hoskins, our board member, who is going to close us out with a couple opportunities for action. And we want to hear from you on our way out. So Nikki, take it away.
Yes, thank you. So we heard about the Congressman Bobby Rush. He plans to reintroduce these 3 federal bills. But I also wanted to say you'll hear more from us through Instagram and through our Facebook account. So please, please, please check us out there. And if you don't have those accounts, you can go to our website, and you'll see some updates, some live updates from there. And also, please support our work. We rely on donations and contributions from you. And so if someone can please go ahead and put our link there, we would really, really appreciate if you can start this new year off with making a donation to PCR. And the last thing we want to do is what's called a Zoom waterfall. And it's a little exercise we want to do, an exercise for justice, if you will. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think about what has inspired you today through this talk. So in other words, how will you take action toward environmental justice going forward? And don't write it in the chat yet. I'm gonna give you 30 seconds to think about it. I want you to type it in the chat, and then when I do a countdown, everybody press enter, and then we'll see the waterfall of justice work that we are promising each other to do going forward. And hopefully that will give us some inspiration to go throughout our day and our month. So let's start our 30 seconds now. Think of something, and if you're using the chat, go ahead and make sure you clicked on everyone in the meeting, and think of the thing that, how will you take action toward environmental justice going forward based on the talk today? All right. $15 more seconds. All right, and 3, 2, 1, everybody press enter. Thank you all so much for your support and your care of Go Forward and Justice. Be safe, take care of yourselves, and remember to think about this movement intersectionally. This is not a one issue thing. We are impacted by intersectional things along justice. Thank you so much, and be safe and be well.
And I would just like to say thank you, Dr. Bullard, for spending your afternoon with us and inspiring us and giving us the information that is needed. But I also would love to say thank you to my family who are also present here. I see Valerie, I see Jamira, I see Jason. These are the extended family of Hazel Johnson.
Wow.
And I'm hoping that they will be my successor in the near future.
Yeah.
Who
Well,
knows?
thank you. Thank you for
And I thank
having.
everyone for coming, and I really do. Go ahead, Dr. Bullard. You like
No,
to
I was
say
gonna say
something?
thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure to honor one of my sheroes and friend, friend. I really miss her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening, and be safe, everybody. Environmental justice for all.
Here, here.